Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden behind the walls of abandoned houses? For Sarah Miller, a 28-year-old single mother from Des Moines, what began as a desperate attempt to provide stability for her family turned into a discovery that would shake an entire Iowa community to its core. Her story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about rural American homesteads. If you're joining us from Cedar Rapids, Council Bluffs, or anywhere across the heartland, you're about to witness one young mother's extraordinary journey that authorities still can't fully explain. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens when Sarah opens that cellar door in Chapter 4. What would you do if you found yourself alone, pregnant, with a toddler, and forced to start over with almost nothing? Let us know in the comments below. Sarah Miller clutched the steering wheel of her 2010 Honda Civic, knuckles white, as she glanced at her sleeping 3-year-old son Ethan in the rearview mirror. His chubby cheeks were still stained with dried tears from their hasty departure from Des Moines this morning. 7 months pregnant and utterly alone, Sarah had finally reached her breaking point after receiving the eviction notice yesterday. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, one hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The baby girl inside gave a reassuring kick, as if to say they'd figure this out together. The autumn cornfields of central Iowa stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, the October sun casting long shadows across the rural landscape. Sarah had $4,327 to her name, her entire life savings, plus what she'd managed to get for selling most of their possessions. After Todd had walked out 4 months ago upon learning about the pregnancy, she'd been barely scraping by as a part-time bookkeeper while juggling childcare for Ethan. Her phone buzzed with another text from her former landlord. "Property must be vacated by Friday. Anything left will be disposed of." Sarah blinked back tears. How had her life spiraled so completely out of control? The GPS directed her to take the next exit toward the small town of Millerville, population 2,184. The realtor had warned her that the property was in need of significant TLC, but at $28,000 for a farmhouse with 5 acres, it was the only thing remotely within her budget. She'd emptied her 401k to make the down payment, viewing the listing only through grainy online photos. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Ethan's sleepy voice came from the back seat as he rubbed his eyes. "We're almost there, sweetie. Our new home is just up ahead," Sarah replied, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. The gravel road crunched beneath their tires as they turned onto Hickory Lane. Ancient oak trees lined the approach to what would be their new beginning. When the farmhouse finally came into view, Sarah's heart sank. The white paint was peeling badly, the front porch sagged dangerously on one side, and several windows were boarded up. "Is that our house?" Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Yes, baby. It needs some fixing up, but it's all ours," Sarah replied, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. What had she done? As she parked in front of the dilapidated structure, her phone pinged with a message from the realtor. "Key under flower pot on porch. Paperwork finalized. Property now yours. Good luck." The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders as she helped Ethan out of his car seat. Wind whistled through the overgrown prairie grass surrounding the property, creating an eerie melody that made Sarah shiver despite the mild autumn temperature. With Ethan's small hand in hers, Sarah approached the porch steps cautiously, testing each one before putting her full weight on the weathered wood. The key was exactly where the realtor had said, under a cracked terracotta pot containing nothing but dirt and cigarette butts. The front door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior that smelled of neglect, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Something earthy and old. Ethan pressed against her leg, suddenly shy in this strange new environment. "Well, this is home now," Sarah said, as much to convince herself as her son. She walked through the front room, noting the surprisingly solid hardwood floors beneath years of dust and grime. The kitchen still contained an ancient cast-iron stove and a porcelain farmhouse sink that, while chipped, appeared functional. "Mommy, I don't like it here," Ethan whispered, his lower lip trembling. Sarah knelt down, ignoring the protest from her pregnant body. "I know it's scary right now, but we're going to make it beautiful, I promise. This is our fresh start." As she stood to continue their exploration, something caught her eye, a framed photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. She moved closer, wiping away a thick layer of dust with her sleeve. The faded image showed a family of 4 standing proudly in front of the same farmhouse, though it looked vastly different. Pristine white paint, flower gardens, and a sense of prosperity that now seemed impossible to imagine. The date, scrawled in the corner, June 1978. What had happened here? How had this once-loved family home fallen into such devastating disrepair? A sudden thud from upstairs made both Sarah and Ethan freeze. "What was that?" Ethan whispered, clutching her hand tightly. "Probably just the wind or an old house settling," Sarah assured him, though her heart had begun racing. "Let's go get our things from the car. We need to set up our sleeping bags before it gets dark." As they turned to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them from the shadows of their new home. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below and tell me what you would do if you were in Sarah's situation. Darkness fell quickly over the Iowa countryside, bringing with it an unsettling silence that Sarah wasn't accustomed to after years of city living. The distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling of field mice in the walls were the only sounds breaking the quiet as she spread out 2 sleeping bags on the living room floor. "But I want to sleep in a bed," Ethan protested, lower lip jutting out in a familiar pout. "I know, sweetie," Sarah replied, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. "But we need to clean everything first. Tomorrow we'll check out the bedrooms, okay? Tonight we're having a special camping adventure inside our new house." Their meager belongings sat in 3 suitcases and a handful of boxes by the front door, all that remained of their life in Des Moines. The battery-powered lantern cast eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper, making the floral patterns seem to dance and shift. After a dinner of peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices on paper plates, Sarah tucked Ethan into his Spider-Man sleeping bag. His eyelids grew heavy as she read from his favorite picture book, one of the few toys she hadn't been forced to sell. "Mommy?" Ethan mumbled, fighting sleep. "Yes, baby? Is Daddy going to visit us at the new house?" Sarah's throat tightened. "No, sweetie. Remember our talk about how Daddy needed to go away for a while?" "Forever away?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "I don't know," she answered honestly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "But what I do know is that we're going to be just fine, the 3 of us." Soon Ethan's breathing deepened into sleep, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the strange creaks and groans of the unfamiliar house. She walked to the kitchen, where she'd managed to get the ancient faucet working, and filled a glass with water that ran slightly brown at first before clearing. Leaning against the counter, she allowed herself a moment of pure panic. What had she done? This house was barely habitable. With winter approaching, she worried about the heating system she hadn't yet located. The pregnancy was progressing without complications, but she was due in just 2 months, and the nearest hospital was 30 miles away in Cedar Falls. A particularly loud creak from above startled her out of her thoughts. There it was again, that feeling of not being entirely alone. Sarah grabbed the flashlight and, against her better judgment, decided to investigate the 2nd floor. The staircase protested under her weight, but held firm as she ascended slowly, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The upstairs hallway revealed 4 closed doors, likely bedrooms and perhaps a bathroom. The first door opened to what appeared to be the master bedroom, with a metal-framed bed still in place, stripped of bedding. A heavy oak dresser stood against one wall, its mirror cracked down the middle. Sarah's flashlight beam caught something on the floor, a child's toy, a small wooden train engine, hand-painted and worn from years of play. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. Ethan would love this. As she slipped it into her pocket, the flashlight illuminated something else, a loose floorboard slightly raised from the others. Curiosity overcoming caution, Sarah knelt awkwardly, her pregnant belly making the movement difficult. She worked her fingers around the edge of the board and lifted. The wood came away easily, as if it had been removed many times before. Inside the small cavity was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah took the journal downstairs, settling on her sleeping bag beside her slumbering son. The lantern provided just enough light to read the faded handwriting on the first page. Property of Margaret Wilson, June 15, 1977. If found, please return to Hickory Lane Farmhouse, Millerville, Iowa. Heart pounding with anticipation, Sarah turned to the first entry. June 15, 1977. We moved in today. David says this farm is going to change our lives, and I believe him. The children are excited about the space to run and play. Little James keeps talking about building a treehouse in that massive oak out back. I have to admit, Despite my initial reservations about moving so far from town, there's something special about this place. The previous owners, the Hendersons, left rather suddenly after 40 years here. The realtor mentioned something about financial troubles, but I sense there's more to the story. Sarah read entry after entry, learning about Margaret's life with her husband David and their 2 children, James and Elizabeth. The family had moved from Chicago seeking a simpler life in rural Iowa. The early entries were filled with optimism, garden planning, renovations, community potlucks. But as Sarah continued reading, the tone of the entries began to shift. October 3rd, 1977. Found another one of those strange symbols carved into the cellar door today. David insists it's just kids playing pranks, but I'm not so sure. The neighbors have been polite but distant. When I mentioned the symbols to Mrs. Hargrove at the general store, she went pale and changed the subject. I'm beginning to wonder what the Hendersons didn't tell us about this place. November 18th, 1977. The noises in the walls have gotten worse. David finally heard them too, but insists it's just raccoons or squirrels that have found their way in. But animals don't move like that, don't follow you from room to room. Elizabeth has been having nightmares, saying someone watches her while she sleeps. I've started to wonder if moving here was a mistake. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she turned to the next page, but a sudden noise from the kitchen made her jump. The journal fell closed in her lap as she strained to listen. It sounded like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the linoleum floor. "Hello?" she called softly, not wanting to wake Ethan. No response, just another creak, then silence. Sarah forced herself to stand, clutching the flashlight tightly. "Is someone there?" As she stepped toward the kitchen doorway, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and something small and dark scurried across the floor. Sarah gasped, then let out a relieved laugh. Just a field mouse, seeking shelter for the night, just like them. Her heart still racing, Sarah returned to her sleeping bag, the journal clutched in her hands. She turned to where she had left off, but the next several pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges behind. The next intact entry was dated nearly 6 months later, May 2nd, 1978. I've made a discovery that changes everything. After all these months of strange occurrences, I finally understand what's happening in this house. It started when I found the hidden compartment beneath the root cellar. What I saw there? The entry ended abruptly, the rest of the page blank. Sarah quickly flipped to the next page, but found only one final entry, the handwriting now shaky and almost frantic. June 8th, 1978. If anyone finds this journal, please know that we tried to protect it. The farm holds secrets deeper than anyone could imagine. We're leaving tonight as soon as I finish packing. David doesn't believe me yet, but he will when I show him what's in the north field. We can't stay here another night. The children aren't safe. No one is safe once they know the truth about... The journal ended there, mid-sentence. Sarah closed it slowly, a chill running down her spine despite the mild night. The family in the photograph, it had to be the Wilsons. They had stood proudly in front of this very house, and then something had driven them away in the middle of the night. Something in the root cellar, something in the north field. Sarah glanced at her sleeping son, then at her rounded belly. In the morning, she would need to explore this property more thoroughly. Whatever secrets this farmhouse held, she needed to know if her children were safe here. As she settled down beside Ethan, pulling her sleeping bag up to her chin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was somehow more awake now, more aware of her presence since she'd read the journal. The walls seemed to lean in slightly, listening, waiting to see what she would do with Margaret Wilson's warnings. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and mournful, a sound that seemed to say, "You are not alone here." Are you still with me? If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more. What do you think Sarah found in that journal? Share your theories in the comments. And if you've ever experienced anything strange in an old house, I'd love to hear about it. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, casting dappled patterns across the living room floor. Sarah awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan was already up, sitting cross-legged beside her, leafing through a picture book. "Morning, Mummy," he said cheerfully. "Can we have breakfast?" Sarah stretched, wincing at the ache in her lower back from sleeping on the hard floor. "Good morning, sunshine. Let's see what we've got." After a simple breakfast of cereal with the last of their milk, Sarah began formulating a plan for the day. They needed to clean at least one bedroom to make it habitable, check the heating system before temperatures dropped further, and, though the thought made her uneasy, locate the root cellar mentioned in Margaret Wilson's journal. "Ethan, how about we play explorers today?" Sarah suggested, helping him into his jacket. "We need to check out our whole kingdom." "Can I be the captain?" Ethan asked eagerly. "Absolutely. Captain Ethan ready to explore." They started with the upstairs bedrooms, finding them dusty but structurally sound. The master bedroom contained the metal bed frame she'd seen last night, and the oak dresser with the cracked mirror. A smaller bedroom had clearly belonged to a young boy once, with faded baseball pennants still tacked to the walls, and a small wooden desk beneath the window. Another room was painted a soft pink, with butterfly stencils around the ceiling. A girl's room, no doubt belonging to Elizabeth Wilson. The bathroom was outdated but functional, with an old clawfoot tub that would need serious scrubbing before use. To Sarah's relief, the toilet flushed, though the pipes groaned in protest. "Mommy, look!" Ethan called from the hallway. He was pointing at a narrow door she hadn't noticed the night before, tucked into an alcove at the end of the hall. "Good spotting, Captain," Sarah said, approaching the door cautiously. It was smaller than the others, perhaps leading to an attic or storage space. The knob turned easily in her hand, revealing a steep staircase that disappeared into darkness. "I don't want to go up there," Ethan said, suddenly clinging to her leg. "That's okay, we'll save that adventure for another day," Sarah agreed, closing the door firmly. Something about those stairs made her uneasy. The darkness seemed too complete, too heavy somehow. Downstairs they discovered a mudroom off the kitchen that contained an ancient but potentially workable washer and dryer. A door from the mudroom led outside to a sagging back porch overlooking an overgrown garden plot, and beyond that, fields stretching to a line of trees that presumably marked the property boundary. "Mommy, can I play outside?" Ethan asked, already inching toward the back door. Sarah hesitated. The yard was a mess of tall grass and unknown plants. "Just stay on the porch for now, okay? I need to check something in the kitchen, and I'll be watching you through the window." With Ethan settled on the porch with his toy trucks, Sarah returned to the kitchen. According to the journal, there had been a root cellar, and such features were common in old Iowa farmhouses. She began searching for an entrance, checking the floorboards for a hatch or trap door. In the pantry, behind empty shelving, she found it, a heavy wooden door set into the floor. A rusted iron ring served as a handle, and around the edges of the door, Sarah could make out faint markings etched into the wood. Symbols, just as Margaret had described. They looked like crude stars or asterisks, cut into the wood with a knife, perhaps, forming a border around the entire door. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt to examine the markings more closely. Were they meant to keep something in or out? Gathering her courage, she grasped the iron ring and pulled. The door resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a groan of protesting hinges. Stale, cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of earth and something else, a metallic tang that reminded Sarah oddly of blood. Steep wooden steps disappeared into darkness. Sarah played her flashlight beam down into the cellar, revealing dirt walls reinforced with timbers, shelves lined with dusty canning jars, and a packed earth floor below. It looked like a typical root cellar, used for storing preserved foods and vegetables through the harsh Iowa winters. She was about to close the door when the flashlight beam caught something on the far wall, a discoloration that didn't match the rest of the earthen surface. Heart in her throat, Sarah made a decision. She would need to go down there. Checking first to make sure Ethan was still contentedly playing on the porch, visible through the window, Sarah began descending the steps cautiously. Each wooden stair creaked beneath her weight, announcing her presence to whatever might be waiting below. At the bottom, she swept her flashlight around the small space. It was perhaps 12 feet square, with rough shelving on 3 walls. Most of the jars were empty, though a few still contained unidentifiable preserved contents, now blackened with age. Sarah approached the discolored section of wall that had caught her attention. Up close, she could see it was a different texture than the surrounding earth, smoother, almost like plaster, and there were more symbols here similar to those around the door above, but more elaborate, arranged in a circular pattern around what appeared to be a small, recessed handle. "Another door," Sarah whispered to herself. She should go back upstairs. She should close up this cellar and pretend she'd never found it. She should pack up Ethan and leave this strange house with its hidden compartments and mysterious symbols. But the memory of Margaret Wilson's words kept her rooted in place. "I've made a discovery that changes everything." Sarah reached out and grasped the handle. It was cold to the touch, made of some kind of metal that didn't seem to have tarnished despite the damp conditions. She pulled gently. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, then pushed, thinking perhaps it worked in the opposite direction. Still nothing. Frustrated, Sarah ran her fingers around the edge of the plastered section, feeling for any clue about how to open it. Her fingers caught on something, a small depression just above the handle. When she pressed it, there was a soft click and the section of wall suddenly shifted inward about an inch. Sarah gasped, stepping back instinctively. Now she could pull the recessed door open, revealing a small cavity beyond. Her hands trembling slightly, she directed the flashlight beam into the opening. Inside was a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, covered in a fine layer of dust. With cautious movements, Sarah removed the box and set it on the dirt floor. It was surprisingly heavy, with no visible lock or latch, just a simple hinged lid. Sarah opened it slowly, unsure of what she might find. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be an old velvet cloth, was a collection of items: a stack of yellowed photographs, several folded documents, a small leather pouch, and an envelope addressed simply to the new owner. A sudden cry from upstairs jolted Sarah back to the present. "Mommy, where are you?" "I'm coming, Ethan," Sarah called back, hastily closing the box and tucking it under her arm. She climbed the stairs as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, emerging from the cellar to find Ethan standing in the kitchen, his lower lip trembling. "I couldn't find you," he said accusingly. "I'm sorry, sweetie. I was just checking something downstairs," Sarah soothed, closing the cellar door firmly behind her. "Did you get tired of playing outside?" Ethan nodded. "And I'm hungry. Let's have some lunch then," Sarah suggested, setting the metal box on the counter and guiding Ethan to the living room where their food supplies were stored. As she prepared simple sandwiches, Sarah couldn't keep her thoughts from returning to the box and its contents. The envelope addressed to the new owner seemed to be calling to her. What information did it contain? Warnings? Explanations? The secret that had driven the Wilson family from their home in the middle of the night. After lunch, with Ethan settled for a nap in his sleeping bag, Sarah finally allowed herself to return to the kitchen and the mysterious box. She opened it again, this time removing the envelope first. It was sealed with red wax, imprinted with a symbol similar to those carved around the cellar door. Breaking the seal carefully, Sarah removed a single sheet of paper, covered on both sides with the same handwriting from the journal. She began to read. "To whoever finds this, if you're reading this letter, you've purchased the farmhouse on Hickory Lane, and you've discovered the hidden compartment in the root cellar. I wish I could tell you to seal it back up and forget what you've found, but I know curiosity is a powerful force. It was my own curiosity that led to our family's undoing. What you need to understand is that this land holds secrets dating back to the earliest settlers. The Hendersons knew, of course. That's why they carved the protection symbols. That's why they never plowed the North Field. That's why, after 40 years, they finally couldn't take it anymore and sold to us, outsiders who wouldn't know any better. In the leather pouch, you'll find a key. It opens the locked cabinet in the tool shed out back, which contains all the research I've gathered about this property and what lies beneath it. The photographs show what I discovered in the North Field, the entrance to something much older than this farm, something the original settlers of Millerville stumbled upon and tried to keep hidden. My husband thinks I've lost my mind. He doesn't believe what I've seen, what I've documented, but the children have seen it too. The things that come out at night, especially when the moon is full. The whispers in the walls aren't animals. The shadows that move independently of any light source aren't tricks of the eye. I'm leaving this for you because you deserve to know what you've purchased. Knowledge is protection. The symbols help, but they're not enough on their own. In the cabinet, you'll find a book bound in dark brown leather. The instructions inside must be followed exactly if you intend to stay here. We're leaving tonight. I can't risk my family any longer. Whatever is beneath this farm has been dormant for a long time, but I fear our presence, our digging, our curiosity has awakened it. May God help you if you choose to stay. Margaret Wilson, June 8th, 1978. Sarah lowered the letter, her mouth dry. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the overgrown yard and making the old house creak and settle. She glanced at Ethan, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the growing knot of dread in his mother's stomach. Sarah reached for the leather pouch, loosening the drawstring to peek inside. Just as Margaret had written, there was a key, old and iron, with an intricate bit pattern. She also removed the stack of photographs, turning them over one by one. The first showed a clearing in what must be the north field, identifiable by a distinctive lightning-struck oak tree on its edge. In the center of the clearing was what appeared to be a stone structure, partially buried in the earth. It looked ancient, with weathered symbols carved into the visible stonework. The second photo showed the same structure from a closer angle, revealing what appeared to be a narrow opening, a passageway leading down into darkness. The third photo made Sarah gasp. It showed Margaret Wilson herself, standing at the entrance to the passage, a lantern in her hand, illuminating just enough of the interior to reveal a staircase descending into the earth. The final photograph was blurry, as if taken in haste. It showed something emerging from the passage, a shape that Sarah's mind couldn't quite process. It seemed to shift and waver, even in the static image, a darkness deeper than the surrounding night with faint outlines that might have been limbs or branches or something else entirely. Sarah dropped the photo as if it had burned her fingers. The rational part of her mind immediately began searching for explanations. A double exposure, a prank, a shadow distorted by the camera flash. But a deeper instinct, something primal and certain, told her that what she was seeing was real. She looked again at the sleeping form of her son, then at her own rounded belly. They had nowhere else to go, no money for another fresh start. This was it, their last chance. Sarah carefully returned everything to the metal box except the key, which she slipped into her pocket. Tonight, after Ethan was asleep, she would find that tool shed and the locked cabinet Margaret had mentioned. She needed to know exactly what they were dealing with, and whether it was possible to make this house safe for her family. As she closed the box, a sudden movement at the kitchen window caught her eye. Sarah turned quickly, but saw only the swaying branches of an old apple tree in the yard, its gnarled limbs scratching against the glass, like fingers seeking entrance. But for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a face peering in at her, pale with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, watching, waiting to see what the new owner of Hickory Lane Farmhouse would do next. Are you still with us? This story is about to take an unexpected turn. If you're enjoying it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Where are you watching from, and have you ever found something unexpected when moving into a new home? Share your experiences in the comments below. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of cleaning and organizing. Sarah focused on making the master bedroom habitable, stripping the ancient mattress they'd found in a hall closet, and covering it with the sheets they'd brought from their apartment. She cleaned until her back ached and sweat beaded on her forehead, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind from dwelling on Margaret Wilson's letter. As dusk approached, Sarah prepared a simple dinner for Ethan, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, despite the growing unease that had settled in her chest. She decided against telling Ethan bedtime stories tonight. The last thing she needed was to feed his imagination in this creaky old house. "Time for bed, Captain," she announced after dinner. "Tomorrow we'll explore the yard, but tonight we get to sleep in a real bed instead of our sleeping bags." "Can I have the wooden train?" Ethan asked, pointing to the toy she'd found upstairs. Sarah hesitated, remembering it had belonged to James Wilson, a child who had fled this house in the night. But it was just a toy, she reasoned, and Ethan had so few playthings now. "Of course," she said, retrieving it from her jacket pocket. "But it's an old toy, so be gentle with it." Ethan took the wooden train reverently, immediately beginning to make chugging sounds as he rolled it along the edge of the mattress. Sarah smiled despite her worries. Children were so resilient, so adaptable. Perhaps they could make this work after all. Once Ethan was tucked into bed beside her, his small body radiating warmth against her side, Sarah found herself listening intently to the sounds of the house. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the darkness. Outside, an owl hooted mournfully, and somewhere in the distance a coyote answered. Sarah waited until Ethan's breathing deepened into sleep before carefully extracting herself from the bed. She retrieved the flashlight and the key from her pocket, then made her way downstairs as quietly as possible. The night had grown cold, and Sarah shivered as she stepped onto the back porch, zipping up her jacket over her pregnancy. The moon was nearly full, bathing the overgrown yard in silver light. About 50 yards from the house stood a small outbuilding that had to be the tool shed Margaret had mentioned. Sarah picked her way carefully through the tall grass, constantly looking back at the house to make sure Ethan was still visible through the bedroom window. The tool shed door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, squealing in protest as she pushed it open. The beam of her flashlight revealed a workspace frozen in time. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard, jars of nails and screws lined shelves, and a workbench dominated the back wall. Behind the workbench stood an old wooden cabinet, its surface scarred and weathered. Sarah approached it with trepidation, noting more of the strange symbols carved into its frame. A heavy padlock secured the doors, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. With trembling fingers, Sarah inserted the key from Margaret's pouch. It turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled. Inside the cabinet, Sarah found exactly what Margaret had described: a dark brown leather book, along with stacks of papers, maps, and what appeared to be journal entries, separate from the book she'd found in the house. Sarah gathered everything into her arms, then hesitated, her flashlight beam catching on something else inside the cabinet, a small wooden box containing a revolver and a box of ammunition. After a moment's consideration, she left the weapon behind. She had Ethan to think about, and she'd never fired a gun in her life. Back inside the house, with the doors locked and Ethan still sleeping peacefully upstairs, Sarah spread the materials across the kitchen table. She started with the leather-bound book Margaret had specifically mentioned. Its pages were yellowed with age, the text handwritten in a script that looked much older than the 1970s. The title page read simply, "A Record of the Hollow and Its Inhabitants" by Thomas Miller, 1867. Sarah frowned at the surname. Miller, the same as her own. A coincidence, surely, but an unsettling one. The book detailed the experiences of Thomas Miller, one of the original settlers of what would become Millerville. According to his account, the settlers had discovered a strange stone structure in a clearing while surveying the land for farming. Initial exploration revealed an underground complex of unknown origin, what Thomas called the Hollow. Sarah read with growing horror as Thomas described what they found below, a vast chamber carved from the living rock with strange symbols covering the walls and a central altar-like structure. More disturbing were his descriptions of the inhabitants, beings that seemed to exist somewhere between shadow and substance, that could move through solid matter and appeared primarily at night. The settlers had inadvertently disturbed something ancient, something that had been sealed away. In a panic, they had attempted to reseal the entrance, marking it with protective symbols derived from a combination of Christian imagery and older pagan signs that one of the settlers, an immigrant from Eastern Europe, had knowledge of. For a time, it seemed to work. The inhabitants remained below ground, emerging only occasionally on nights when the moon was full. The settlers established their farms and eventually their town, always careful to leave the North Field undisturbed, passing down the knowledge of the Hollow from generation to generation. Thomas Miller had appointed himself keeper of this knowledge, documenting everything he could discover about the strange beings and the symbols that seemed to repel them. The book contained detailed drawings of the protective symbols, the same ones Sarah had seen carved around the cellar door and on the cabinet. Sarah turned to the loose papers, which appeared to be Margaret Wilson's own research. She had made connections that Thomas Miller hadn't, linking the symbols to ancient European protective sigils and the descriptions of the inhabitants to folklore about shadow people and other dimensional beings. More disturbing was a newspaper clipping from 1943, detailing the disappearance of a local child who had last been seen playing near the North Field. The article mentioned it was the third such disappearance in the area since 1912. According to Margaret's notes, the Hendersons, the family that had owned the farm for 40 years before selling to the Wilsons, had maintained the protections faithfully, reinforcing the symbols regularly and performing seasonal rituals outlined in Thomas Miller's book. But they had grown old, and their children had moved away, refusing to take on the responsibility of the farm and its secrets. Sarah's eyes were burning with fatigue, but she couldn't stop reading. The final pages of Margaret's notes detailed her growing certainty that the beings were becoming more active, that her children were in danger. The last entry, dated June 7, 1978, the day before they fled, contained a frantic description of shadows gathering at the edge of the North Field, of whispers growing louder in the walls, of her son James waking screaming from nightmares about the people with no faces. A sudden noise from upstairs made Sarah jump. Ethan was crying out in his sleep. She rushed upstairs to find him thrashing in the bed, the wooden train clutched tightly in his small hand. "Ethan, wake up," Sarah said gently, shaking his shoulder. "You're having a bad dream." Ethan's eyes flew open, wild with fear. "The train man was chasing me." "Train man?" Sarah asked, her blood running cold. "The boy with the train. He said we need to leave before they come inside," Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He said they're hungry again." Sarah gathered her son into her arms, rocking him gently. "It was just a dream, baby, just a dream." But over Ethan's shoulder, Sarah's gaze was drawn to the window, where the full moon illuminated the overgrown yard, and beyond it, the north field, its tall grass rippling in patterns that didn't match the direction of the wind. As she watched, a dark figure detached itself from the shadow of an oak tree at the field's edge. It stood motionless for a long moment, a silhouette too tall and too thin to be human. Then, with a movement like smoke curling upward, it seemed to dissolve back into the darkness. Sarah clutched Ethan tighter, her mind racing. They needed to leave, just as the Wilsons had. But there was nowhere for them to go, no money for another fresh start. And Sarah wasn't sure she could manage the journey in her condition. Her due date was growing closer, and the baby had been unusually active all evening, as if sensing her distress. No, they would have to stay, at least until the baby was born, but they would need protection. Once Ethan had fallen back asleep, Sarah returned downstairs to Thomas Miller's book, searching for the ritual he had described for strengthening the protective barriers. It required redrawing the symbols with a mixture of salt, iron filings, and the performer's own blood, materials she could gather tomorrow. The ritual needed to be performed at sunrise, when the barriers between worlds were said to be strongest. Sarah set her phone alarm for dawn, then returned to bed, curling protectively around her son. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that things had been set in motion the moment she turned the key in the lock of this old farmhouse, that perhaps she hadn't chosen this place by chance, that perhaps it had been waiting for her, for a miller to return to the land where it all began. Outside in the north field, shadows moved against the moonlight, gathering, watching, waiting for the barrier to weaken just enough for them to find a way inside. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're only halfway through Sarah's journey, and things are about to get even more intense. What would you do if you were in Sarah's position? Would you stay and fight, or take your chances on the road? Let us know in the comments below. Sarah awoke before her alarm, jolted from sleep by Ethan's small hand patting her cheek. "Mommy, there's someone in the yard," he whispered, his eyes wide. Sarah sat up quickly, wincing at the protest from her pregnant body. Dawn was just beginning to break, pale light filtering through the curtainless windows. She moved to the glass, Ethan pressed against her side. The yard below was empty, the tall grass motionless in the still morning air. But at the edge of the north field, a figure stood beneath the lightning-struck oak, a woman in what appeared to be a long dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Stay here, Ethan," Sarah instructed, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'll go see who it is." "Don't go, Mommy," Ethan pleaded, clutching her nightshirt. "She's not real." Sarah hesitated, looking back out the window. The figure remained motionless, facing the house. Something about the way she stood, so perfectly still, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. But she needed answers, and this might be her only chance to speak with someone who knew the property. "I'll be right back," she promised, helping Ethan back into bed. "Don't leave this room, okay? Captain's orders." Downstairs, Sarah pulled on her jacket and boots, then grabbed the flashlight, though she doubted she'd need it in the growing daylight. Her hand hovered over the kitchen drawer where she'd stashed the box from the cellar, then moved to the counter where she'd left Thomas Miller's book. On impulse, she took the book with her. Outside, the air was bitingly cold, her breath forming clouds in front of her face. The grass was heavy with dew, soaking the hem of her pajama pants as she made her way toward the oak tree. As she approached, she could see the woman more clearly, middle-aged, with streaks of grey in her dark hair, wearing a floral print dress that looked decades out of style. "Hello," Sarah called when she was about 20 yards away. "Can I help you?" The woman turned slowly, and Sarah gasped. Her face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark circles beneath her eyes. but it was unmistakably the same face from the photograph in the farmhouse. Margaret Wilson. "You found my journal," Margaret said, her voice thin and distant. "And Thomas's book." Sarah clutched the leather-bound volume tighter. "How did you—" "Time works differently for them," Margaret interrupted, her gaze drifting toward the north field. "And for those who've seen them, I knew when you found the compartment. I could feel it." "What are they?" Sarah asked, taking a step closer despite her instinct to run. "Thomas called them inhabitants, but that's not quite right. They were here before us, before anything human walked this land. They exist partially in our world, partially in somewhere else." "Are they dangerous?" Margaret's hollow laugh held no humor. "They're hungry, always hungry. They feed on fear, on life itself. The barriers keep them contained, mostly, but they're weakening." "The symbols," Sarah said. "The ones carved around the cellar door on the cabinet." Margaret nodded. "Protection sigils. Thomas learned them from one of the other settlers, adapted them. They work, but they need to be maintained. Blood and salt and iron, the elements that bind our world, that keep the barriers strong." "Why did you leave?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the journal and notes. "They were getting stronger. My children were having nightmares, seeing things. David didn't believe me at first, but then—" Margaret's voice trailed off, her gaze growing distant. "Then he saw one of them take shape from his own shadow, reach for our daughter while she slept. We left that night." "But you came back," Sarah said, a statement rather than a question. Margaret's eyes refocused on Sarah's face. "Not in the way you think. I never left, not really. Part of me has always been here, will always be here, just like part of Thomas Miller never left." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her rounded belly. "Miller. That's my name too, Sarah Miller." Something like recognition flickered in Margaret's hollow eyes. "Of course it is. The land remembers its keeper. The barriers respond to Miller blood." "I don't understand." "You will," Margaret said, her form seeming to waver slightly, like heat rising from pavement. "The ritual in Thomas's book. You need to perform it today, before the sun reaches its peak. The full moon makes them strongest, and last night—" She glanced toward the house. "They're closer than they've been in decades." "My son," Sarah said, suddenly remembering Ethan alone in the bedroom. He had a nightmare about a boy, with a train telling him to leave. "James," Margaret whispered, pain crossing her gaunt features. "My son. They took him first, 3 months after we fled. He was playing in the woods behind our new house, and he just never came back." Her form wavered more pronouncedly now. "Elizabeth followed a year later. David couldn't bear it. He took his own life. And I came back here, trying to understand, to stop them somehow. But it was too late for me." Sarah took an involuntary step backward, the full horror of Margaret's words sinking in. "You're not really here, are you?" "Not in the way you mean," Margaret confirmed, her outline blurring at the edges. "But I'm not one of them either. I exist in between, like so many others who've encountered the inhabitants and survived, at least initially." "How do I protect my family?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking slightly. "How do we survive this? The ritual, blood and salt and iron, renew the barriers. And then—" Margaret's form grew more transparent, her voice fainter. "Find the center stone in the hollow. It's marked with a spiral. The inhabitants can't touch it. It burns them somehow. If you can decipher the markings on it—" "What markings? What do they say?" Sarah called, as Margaret's figure became little more than a shimmer in the morning light. "I never had enough time to study them fully, but I believe they're instructions, a way to seal the hollow permanently. Thomas thought so too, but he died before he could translate them completely." Margaret was barely visible now, her voice just a whisper on the wind. "Be careful, Sarah Miller. They know you're here now. They can sense the child you carry. New life is irresistible to them." With those final words, Margaret Wilson's form dissipated entirely, leaving Sarah alone beneath the lightning-struck oak, clutching Thomas Miller's book to her chest, her other hand protectively covering her belly. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Sarah turned back toward the house, her mind racing. The ritual needed to be performed immediately. She could gather salt from their meager food supplies, but iron filings would be more difficult. Inside, she found Ethan sitting at the bottom of the stairs, his face tear-streaked. "You were gone too long," he accused. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Sarah said, kneeling awkwardly to hug him. I was talking to a neighbor. The ghost lady? Ethan asked matter-of-factly. Sarah pulled back to look at him, startled. What makes you think she was a ghost? Because I could see through her, Ethan said simply, and the train boy told me about her. He says she tries to help, but she can't leave. Sarah's throat tightened. Ethan, when did the train boy tell you this? Last night in my dream, and this morning too while you were outside. He was standing in the corner, but he wouldn't come closer. He said the shadows don't like him. Sarah looked to the corner of the room, half expecting to see the spectral form of James Wilson, but there was nothing there, nothing visible at least. Ethan, I need to do something important this morning, something to keep us safe, Sarah explained, leading him to the kitchen. I'll need your help. To keep away the shadows? Ethan asked. Sarah nodded, opening Thomas Miller's book on the table. Exactly. The ritual was detailed precisely. A mixture of salt, iron filings, and the blood of a miller, applied to each of the protection symbols around the property. The most important locations were the cellar door, the four corners of the house's foundation, and the perimeter of the north field. For the iron filings, Sarah found an old hand file in the tool shed and used it to scrape particles from an iron nail, collecting them in a small dish. Salt was easier, thankfully. They had a nearly full container with their food supplies. The blood was the part that made her stomach turn, but the book was clear. It had to be freely given by a miller. Sarah sterilized a needle from her sewing kit with a match, then pricked her finger, allowing several drops of blood to fall into the mixture of salt and iron filings. She stirred it with a wooden spoon until it formed a thick paste. What now? Ethan asked, watching the process with solemn eyes. Now we need to put this mixture on special marks around the house, Sarah explained. It's like a special protection spell. To keep the shadows out, Ethan nodded. Sarah started with the cellar door, retracing each of the carved symbols with the mixture, carefully following the diagrams in Thomas's book. The paste seemed to sink into the wood as she applied it, the symbols briefly glowing with a faint bluish light before fading back to normal. It's working, Ethan whispered in awe. Next came the foundation corners, which required Sarah to crawl awkwardly around the exterior of the house, Ethan holding the container of paste for her. At each corner, she found a symbol carved into the cornerstone, nearly invisible beneath decades of dirt and weathering. The final and most crucial part was the perimeter of the north field. According to Thomas's book, there were 7 stones placed in a circle around the field, each marked with a protection sigil. These formed the primary barrier containing the inhabitants. We need to find 7 special rocks, Sarah told Ethan as they approached the field's edge. They should be partly buried in the ground, in a big circle around the whole field. I'm good at finding things, Ethan declared, immediately beginning to search the tall grass. It took them nearly an hour to locate all 7 stones. They were weathered and moss-covered, but each bore the same spiral symbol surrounded by smaller markings. Sarah carefully applied the paste to each one, watching as the mixture was absorbed into the stone, the symbols momentarily illuminated before fading. As she finished the final stone, a strange sensation rippled through the air, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm, but more localized, centered on the field itself. The tall grass went suddenly still, though Sarah could feel a breeze on her face. "Mummy, look," Ethan said, pointing toward the center of the field. There, barely visible through the grass, stood what appeared to be a stone archway, perhaps 4 feet tall. Sarah was certain it hadn't been there when they began their work, or if it had been hidden somehow, invisible until the protections were renewed. "Is that the hollow?" Ethan asked. "I think so," Sarah replied, taking his hand firmly in hers. "But we're not going there. Not today." A sound caught her attention, a faint, distant whispering that seemed to come from the archway, words just below the threshold of comprehension. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up as the whispers grew slightly louder, carrying notes of anger or frustration. "They don't like what we did," Ethan said, pressing against her side. "No, they don't," Sarah agreed. "But they can't hurt us now. The protections are renewed." As if in response to her words, the whispering subsided, and the stone archway seemed to flicker, becoming less substantial, more like a mirage than a solid structure. Within moments, it had vanished entirely, leaving only waving grass where it had stood. "Is it gone?" Ethan asked. "Just hidden," Sarah said. "Let's go back to the house. We've done enough for today." As they turned away from the field, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by dozens of invisible eyes, that the very air around the field had become charged with malevolence. The protections were holding for now, but Margaret's warning echoed in her mind. They needed to find the center stone with the spiral, to decipher the markings that might permanently seal the hollow. But that would mean entering the hollow itself, venturing into the underground complex where the inhabitants dwelled. The thought made Sarah's blood run cold. Not now, not in her condition, not with Ethan to protect. Perhaps after the baby was born, when she had recovered her strength. For now, the renewed barriers would have to be enough. Back at the house, Sarah made a simple lunch for Ethan, her mind still processing everything she'd learned. Their situation was more precarious than she'd initially realized. The inhabitants were clearly dangerous. They had taken the Wilson children even after the family had fled, and Sarah herself was a miller, apparently descended from the very man who had discovered the hollow and established the initial protections. Was that why she'd been drawn to this property? Why, out of all the cheap rural houses she might have purchased, this one had seemed to call to her? The thought was unsettling, suggesting a design beyond coincidence. As she watched Ethan eat his sandwich, a new determination settled over her. Whatever forces had brought them here, whatever dangers lurked in the North Field, she would protect her children. She would decipher the markings on the center stone, find a way to seal the hollow permanently, and break whatever curse had claimed so many lives over the generations. Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the baby shift within her. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, as much to convince herself as the child she carried. "We're millers. This is our land now, and we will defend it." In the North Field, unseen in the bright afternoon sunlight, shadows gathered and whispered, their plans momentarily thwarted, but their hunger undiminished. They had waited for generations. They could wait a little longer. Wait, what happens next? If you're as invested in Sarah's story as we are, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What do you think is really happening in that North Field? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, give this video a thumbs up to help others find it too. 2 months passed with surprising tranquility. Sarah and Ethan settled into a routine in their new home, cleaning one room at a time, making the old farmhouse gradually more livable. Sarah found an old rocking chair in the attic and placed it in what would become the nursery, a small room adjacent to the master bedroom that she painted a soft yellow with supplies discovered in the tool shed. The protections held firm. Occasionally, Sarah would wake in the night to hear distant whispers or catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the North Field, but nothing crossed the boundary. Nothing approached the house. Ethan still spoke sometimes of the train boy, claiming James Wilson visited in his dreams, but the nightmares had stopped. Sarah renewed the blood and salt mixture every week, just as Thomas Miller's book instructed. She avoided the North Field when possible, though sometimes she felt drawn to it, especially at dusk when the boundary between worlds seemed thinnest. On those evenings, she would stand at the kitchen window, watching the tall grass wave in patterns that didn't match the wind, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, as if responding to something Sarah herself couldn't quite perceive. Winter arrived, with a heavy snowfall that transformed the property into a pristine white landscape. The old farmhouse proved remarkably well insulated once Sarah figured out how to operate the ancient furnace, and they passed Christmas in quiet contentment, decorating a small pine tree Ethan found near the garden with homemade ornaments crafted from bits of colored paper and string. As January progressed, Sarah's due date drew nearer. She had made arrangements with a midwife in Cedar Falls, planning to drive herself to the birthing center when labor began. It wasn't ideal, but without family or close friends nearby, it was the best solution she could arrange. The baby, however, had other plans. Sarah awoke in the middle of the night on January 15th to a sharp cramping sensation and the unmistakable gush of her water breaking. Panic gripped her immediately. A blizzard had been raging since sunset, with nearly a foot of snow already accumulated and more falling rapidly. The roads would be impassable, especially in her old Honda. "Okay, don't panic," Sarah whispered to herself, carefully extracting herself from bed where Ethan slept soundly beside her. First babies usually take their time. The storm might let up by morning. She waddled to the bathroom, gripping the wall as another contraction rippled through her. This one was stronger, lasting nearly a minute. Sarah checked her phone, no service, as had been the case since the storm began. The landline they'd discovered in the kitchen hadn't worked since they moved in. By dawn, it was clear that the baby wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. Sarah's contractions were coming regularly, 5 minutes apart and intensifying. She had experienced false labor twice in the previous weeks, but this was unmistakably the real thing. "Ethan, sweetheart, wake up," Sarah said gently, shaking her son's shoulder. "Mommy needs your help today. The baby is coming." Ethan's eyes widened as he sat up. "Now? In the snow?" "Yes, right here at home," Sarah confirmed, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "You're going to be a big brother today." Sarah had read books about emergency home births, trying to prepare for this possibility given their remote location. She had gathered clean towels, sterilized scissors, and other supplies in a box kept under the bathroom sink. Now she sent Ethan to retrieve it while she arranged blankets on the bed. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, forcing her to lean against the wall and breathe through the pain. When it passed, she became aware of a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping at the bedroom window. Sarah turned toward the noise. Through the frost-edged glass, she could make out a small, pale face peering in, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, with solemn eyes and a concerned expression. James Wilson. He pointed urgently toward the north field, then made a pushing motion with his hands, as if trying to indicate something approaching. "Not now," Sarah whispered. "Please, not now." The ghostly boy's expression grew more distressed. He pointed again, more emphatically, then vanished as Ethan returned with the supply box. "Mommy, are you okay?" Ethan asked, setting the box on the bed. "Yes, sweetheart. The baby's just coming a little faster than I expected," Sarah said, easing herself onto the bed as another contraction began. This one was different, accompanied by an overwhelming urge to push. Outside, the wind howled with renewed vigor, rattling the windows in their frames. Sarah could have sworn she heard whispers within the sound, voices calling her name, voices that knew she was vulnerable. "Ethan," she gasped when the contraction passed, "I need you to do something very important. In the kitchen drawer there's a special mixture Mommy made, the one we put on the special marks." "The protection spell?" Ethan asked. "Yes. I need you to put some on all the doors and windows, every single one, okay? It's very important." As Ethan hurried from the room, Sarah felt the baby descending, her body taking over with instincts older than civilization. Another contraction seized her, and she bore down, gripping the edges of the mattress. Through the window, she could see the storm intensifying, snow swirling in unnatural patterns. Within the white maelstrom, darker shapes seemed to move, approaching the house with deliberate slowness, testing the boundaries of the protection. They knew. Somehow they knew she was giving birth, that new life was entering the world, life they craved to consume. Sarah screamed as another contraction peaked, the pressure unbearable. Where was Ethan? Had he managed to reinforce the protections? As if in answer to her unspoken question, her son appeared in the doorway, his small face serious. "I did all the doors and windows, Mummy." The marks glowed blue like before. "Good boy," Sarah gasped. "Now come here, I need you to help me." The next hour passed in a blur of pain and effort. Ethan proved remarkably composed, bringing water when asked, holding his mother's hand during contractions, and speaking words of encouragement that sounded oddly adult, coming from his 3-year-old mouth. "You're doing great, Mommy," he said, as Sarah pushed through a particularly intense contraction. "The train boy says the baby is almost here." Sarah was too focused on the task at hand to question the source of this information. The urge to push was overwhelming now, her body working with primal efficiency to bring new life into the world. With a final, guttural cry, Sarah felt the baby slip from her body in a rush of relief and fluid. She reached down blindly, her hands finding the wet, squirming form of her newborn daughter. "She's here," Sarah sobbed, lifting the baby to her chest. "Ethan, your sister is here." The infant let out a healthy wail as Sarah rubbed her vigorously with a clean towel. Pink skin, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a thatch of dark hair plastered to a perfectly shaped head. She was beautiful, and miraculously appeared completely healthy, despite the unplanned home birth. Outside, the storm had reached a crescendo, snow and wind battering the old house with supernatural fury. The whispers had grown louder, no longer disguised by the wind, but distinct, angry, frustrated by their inability to breach the protections. Sarah became aware of another presence in the room, The ghostly form of James Wilson, standing at the foot of the bed, a small smile on his transparent face. He nodded once at Sarah, then turned to Ethan. "He says she's special," Ethan translated, apparently able to hear the spirit's words. "He says she has the strongest Miller blood in generations. They're afraid of her." Sarah looked down at her newborn daughter, now quieting against her chest, eyes closed in exhausted sleep. "Who is afraid of her?" "The shadow people," Ethan said simply. "The train boy says they know she can close the door forever if she touches the center stone." The ghostly boy nodded emphatically, then turned toward the window, his expression changing to one of alarm. Outside, the storm had taken on an unnatural quality. The snowflakes seemed to hang suspended in the air. Time itself momentarily paused. In that frozen moment, Sarah saw them clearly for the first time. Dozens of shadowy figures surrounding the house, pressing against an invisible barrier that rippled with faint blue light each time they touched it. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Their proportions elongated, their edges constantly shifting like smoke in wind. Where faces should have been, they had only deeper patches of darkness, with occasional glints that might have been eyes. The ghost of James Wilson raised his hands, and the protections flared brighter. The shadows retreated momentarily, their whispers rising to angry hisses. "Why is he helping us?" Sarah asked, clutching her newborn daughter closer. "He says the shadows took him and his sister," Ethan explained, watching the ghostly boy with fascination. "He says they're trapped between here and there, but they still remember being human. They don't want the shadows to take anyone else." The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, frost forming on the inside of the windows. The shadows pressed forward again with renewed determination, the protective barrier visibly weakening with each assault. "The protections are failing," Sarah realized aloud. "Ethan, we need more of the mixture." But before Ethan could move, the ghost of James Wilson shook his head vehemently. He pointed at the baby, then at Sarah, then made a circular motion with his finger. "He says we need to complete the circle," Ethan interpreted. "The baby needs to touch the center stone while she's still connected to you, before the cord is cut." Sarah looked down at the umbilical cord still linking her to her newborn daughter, then back at the ghostly boy in disbelief. "He wants me to take her to the hollow now in this." James nodded urgently, pointing again to the shadows outside, which were pressing harder against the weakening barrier. "I can't," Sarah protested. "I just gave birth. I can barely walk." The ghost's expression grew desperate. He mimed rocking a baby, then pointed to his own chest, then to Ethan. "He says he and Elizabeth will protect the baby if you carry her," Ethan translated. "He says there isn't much time." As if to emphasize this point, a hairline crack appeared in the window glass, spreading slowly outward like ice across a pond. The shadows outside seemed to notice, their whispers rising to a gleeful chorus. Sarah looked at her newborn daughter, still connected to her by the umbilical cord, then at the deteriorating situation outside. She had come to this farmhouse seeking a fresh start, a safe haven for her children. Instead, she had stumbled into a generations-old conflict between worlds. Now it seemed her daughter might be the key to ending it once and for all. "Okay," Sarah decided, summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "Help me up, Ethan." With her son's assistance and a surge of maternal determination, Sarah managed to stand, cradling her newborn daughter against her chest. The placenta had delivered, but she left the umbilical cord intact, wrapping both mother and child in a clean blanket. "What about the shadows?" Ethan asked, looking fearfully at the window where the crack continued to spread. In response, the ghost of James Wilson beckoned them to follow, moving toward the bedroom door. As they stepped into the hallway, another ghostly figure appeared, a girl of perhaps 12 with the same solemn eyes as James. Elizabeth Wilson had joined her brother. The ghost children led the way downstairs and to the back door. Outside, the storm raged, but directly behind the house a narrow path had opened in the swirling snow, leading straight toward the north field. The shadows seemed concentrated on the front of the house, unaware of this development. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked Ethan, who was still somehow communicating with the ghost children. "They say it's the only way," Ethan replied. "The center stone needs Miller blood, both of yours together, to seal the hollow forever." Sarah took a deep breath, clutching her newborn daughter close to her chest. "Then let's finish this." They stepped out into the storm, following the ghost children along the clear path. The cold bit at Sarah's exposed skin, but the baby remained warm against her body, protected by the blanket and Sarah's own heat. Ethan stayed close to her side, occasionally steadying her when her weakened legs threatened to give way. The north field appeared different in the daylight, the snow covering the tall grass and creating an otherworldly landscape of white. In the center, the stone archway had reappeared, no longer a mirage but solid and ancient, its surface covered in the same symbols found throughout the property. The ghost children led them directly to the archway. James pointed downward, indicating a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Elizabeth made a gesture of reassurance, placing her transparent hand over the baby as if in blessing. "I can't see down there," Sarah said, hesitating at the top of the stairs. In response, the ghost children began to glow faintly, illuminating the staircase with a soft blue light. James went first, followed by Ethan, then Sarah with the baby, with Elizabeth bringing up the rear. The stairs descended perhaps 20 feet before opening into a large circular chamber carved from the living rock. The walls were covered in the now familiar symbols, which seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence in the presence of the ghost children. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, roughly waist-high, its surface inscribed with a spiral pattern that drew the eye inward. James pointed to it emphatically. "The center stone," Sarah whispered, approaching it slowly. Above them, a commotion erupted, howling wind and angry whispers growing louder. The shadows had discovered their location. "Hurry, Mummy," Ethan urged, his small face pinched with worry. Sarah placed her hand on the stone altar. It was warm to the touch despite the winter cold, vibrating slightly with some inner energy. The spiral pattern seemed to move beneath her fingers, rotating slowly inward. "What do I do?" she asked the ghost children. Through Ethan, James explained, "Put the baby on the stone with the cord still connecting you. Then place your hand on the spiral. The stone will do the rest." Sarah hesitated, maternal instinct rebelling at the thought of placing her newborn on the cold stone. But the chamber had begun to darken, shadows seeping down the staircase like black water. With a prayer to whatever forces might be listening, Sarah gently laid her daughter on the center stone. The baby's eyes opened at the movement, revealing irises of such a deep blue they appeared almost violet. She didn't cry but gazed upward with an awareness that seemed impossible in a newborn. Sarah placed her own hand on the spiral pattern, maintaining contact with both the stone and her daughter. The umbilical cord pulsed between them, still carrying blood from mother to child and back again. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows continued their advance, now forming distinct shapes at the chamber entrance. The ghost children positioned themselves protectively around the altar, their pale forms glowing brighter in defiance. Then, the spiral beneath Sarah's hand began to warm, the pattern glowing with an intensifying blue light that matched the aura of the ghost children. The light spread outward along the floor of the chamber, following channels carved into the rock that Sarah hadn't noticed before, a larger version of the same spiral, extending to the very walls. The shadows recoiled from the advancing light, their whispers turning to shrieks of protest. The stone beneath Sarah's hand grew hotter, not painfully so, but with a vibrant warmth that seemed to flow through her body, down the umbilical cord, and into her daughter. The baby girl on the altar began to glow with the same blue light, her tiny face serene despite the chaos erupting around them. The shadows pressed against the light, trying to reach the altar, but the ghost children formed a barrier, their own light pulsing in rhythm with the spiral. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the cacophony. "The closing," Ethan translated from James, who was watching the proceedings with a look of sad triumph. "The center stone is using your blood, your shared blood, to seal the way between worlds." The light had reached the chamber walls now, illuminating each symbol in sequence. As each one activated, a portion of the shadows seemed to be drawn into the wall itself, absorbed into the very rock. Their shrieks grew more desperate, more enraged, but they were powerless against the ancient mechanism that had been triggered. Sarah felt a strange sensation in her hand, as if the spiral pattern was imprinting itself on her skin. The baby began to make soft cooing sounds, seemingly untroubled by the extraordinary events unfolding around her. With a final, deafening shriek, the last of the shadows were drawn into the walls. The blue light pulsed once more, blindingly bright, then began to fade gradually. As it receded, Sarah noticed a change in the chamber. The symbols on the walls were different now, their pattern altered subtly but significantly. James Wilson smiled, a look of peace spreading across his ghostly features. He said something to Ethan, who translated, "It's done. The hollow is sealed. They can never return to this world." "What about you and your sister?" Sarah asked, gently lifting her daughter from the altar. The stone had grown cold again, the spiral pattern now inert, its purpose fulfilled. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that follows something vast and final, when the world itself seems to be holding its breath. Sarah cradled her newborn daughter against her chest, the warmth of her small body grounding her to reality. The ghostly glow that had filled the chamber was gone, replaced by the dim blue light filtering through cracks in the stone ceiling. The air smelled of earth and iron, but the oppressive presence that had hung over the hollow for generations was gone, truly gone. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice small in the stillness. "Mommy, are they gone?" Sarah looked around the chamber. The shadows had vanished entirely. The walls, once etched with flickering symbols, now pulsed faintly with a gentle light that felt protective rather than ominous. The ghost children stood side by side near the entrance, their faces calm and almost radiant. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. "They're gone. It's over." James and Elizabeth stepped closer, their forms shimmering with an ethereal brightness. For the first time, Sarah could see what they might have looked like in life. Healthy, laughing children with bright eyes and hopeful smiles. "Thank you," James said softly, his voice now audible even to Sarah. "You did what none of us could." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "You helped me, both of you." Elizabeth smiled faintly, reaching out to touch the baby's head. Her ghostly hand passed through without resistance, but for a brief instant, Sarah thought she saw her daughter's eyes open and meet Elizabeth's. The baby cooed softly, and the faint spiral pattern that had been imprinted on Sarah's palm glowed once more before fading completely. "Her name," Sarah said suddenly, looking down at the child in her arms. "I'll call her Margaret, for the woman who tried to save us all." The ghost children nodded in approval. Then, with a flash of light as soft as dawn, they began to fade, their outlines dissolving into the walls of the chamber until only the faintest traces of blue shimmered where they had stood. Sarah felt tears roll down her cheeks, not of fear or sorrow, but of release. The hollow was sealed. The Wilsons were finally free. Ethan tugged on her sleeve. "Can we go home now, Mummy?" Sarah smiled weakly. "Yes, baby, let's go home." The climb back up the stone staircase was slow and painful, her body trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. But every step felt lighter, the air growing warmer as they neared the surface. When they emerged into the snow-covered field, the storm had stopped completely. The sky above was clear, the morning sun breaking through the clouds in golden rays that bathed the farmhouse in light. The world looked new. By the time Sarah reached the porch, the baby was asleep again, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. Ethan ran ahead to open the door, his laughter echoing across the still air. Inside, the house felt different, brighter, alive, no longer burdened by centuries of fear. Sarah sat in the rocking chair by the window, wrapping herself and the baby in a blanket. Outside, the snow began to melt under the sunlight, revealing the faint outlines of the 7 protective stones around the field, now glowing softly like distant stars. Ethan climbed into her lap, resting his head against her shoulder. "Is it really over?" he asked sleepily. "Yes," Sarah said, kissing his forehead. "It's really over." In the distance, a train whistle sounded faintly, a comforting, ordinary sound that reminded her of life continuing beyond the farmhouse. She smiled, rocking gently as the baby stirred and sighed. For the first time in a long while, Sarah Miller felt peace,